Hello, everyone. Nice to be with you once again. Today, I have with me a very distinguished person, Ed Meyers. He has a long history of working in public policy. On top of it, he has a PhD in government and politics. I have worked with him for several years. He has been a regulator for utilities in Washington, D.C., a person with a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge, lives in Washington, D.C. Before I turn it over to Ed, let me say that at the end, he will tell us about one of his favorite songs, which is, believe me, quite relevant for public policy. Okay, we'll wait for that song at the end. Maybe Ed will sing it also. But for the moment, let's hear from him on the serious issue that he's going to talk about. Over to you, Ed.
Thank you, Subodh, and I appreciate the opportunity, the invitation that you've given me here. And don't worry, I won't sing anything, so you don't have to click me off quite just yet. But getting serious, I have often wondered why we are so accepting of poverty in our nation. So I will be discussing some attitudes that we may have about poverty. Sure, we've made lots of progress in our broader society, opening up our full society, the corporations, universities, the suburbs, everything. And I don't want to minimize that at all. But I do want to say that we have 42 million people in America living in poverty, and millions more very close to the poverty line. The poverty rate is more than double among Black Americans and Hispanic Americans than compared to whites. Among Native Americans, it is more than triple. For Black children and female-headed households, the poverty rate is 42%. The net worth of a typical white family is nearly 10 times greater than that of a Black family. A lot of times we focus on the upper 1% as the cause of all our disparities, but it's not really that simple. The income share of the top 20% is now almost double than it was in 1975. So you see, many of us are in that category. I won't ask you and I won't say about me, but many of us are close to it. And that's where the attitudes are shaped. So it's not just the upper 1% who are taking so much of the wealth and income share, it's millions of us.
So Ed, let me stop you there for a moment and add that as an economist, the Gini coefficient in the US has been increasing steadily. The Gini coefficient measures inequality. You are talking qualitatively, so let me add the quantification here, that the Gini coefficient has gone up from something like 0.39 to 0.49 now. We used to think in the old days that 0.45 is a danger signal, in the sense that it's too much. The disparities in society are too high, but we are a little bit higher than that. I just want to add this data to your qualitative statement. So sorry to interrupt, but let's
No,
go.
that was good. I'm glad to hear that. And it affects social mobility too, these increasing inequalities. And right now we rank rather low in social mobility compared to European nations, let's say. And so people get stuck in deep concentrations of urban poverty. And that's mostly what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about society in general. I'm just looking at urban situations that I've worked closely throughout my career. So getting into the attitudes themselves, those of us who are pretty affluent often have different attitudes about poverty than those living in intense poverty concentrations. Now, if you ask 10 different people who have worked in low-income areas and who also live in fairly affluent areas, what their takeaways from this divergence are, you'll get 10 different answers. So what I'm going to say is, as you say, qualitative, and it's subjective. But here are some of my differences that I see in attitudes between affluent societies and lower income societies. First of all, apathy. Now, many people, not us, not you, hopefully not me, most affluent people can go all day without thinking about the millions trapped in poverty. Now, truthfully, it's not all day. It's all week, it's all month, it's all year, and it goes on from there. People don't really think about this with entertainment and, the struggles of daily life and all that. But if you go into the cities, of course, you compare that apathy to the stress and trauma that you find in deep poverty areas. People who have money say, you can't throw money after poverty as a way to treat poverty. Well, money is useful. I hope that's not too controversial. Money is how we all buy the things we need. Of course, low-income people need the same goods and services that we do, the shelter, the food, medical, everything. And instead of throwing money at poverty, people say, we have to get the parents to become more involved. We do have very involved parents in poverty areas who are quite successful in raising kids. And I see these families, these parents all the time, or I used to, not so much in my retirement. I knew hundreds of them by name, first name, and they've been very successful. But we also, in our dysfunctional society, have dysfunctional parents as a result of so many years of discrimination, housing, and jobs, education, the whole bit. What happens to those kids who are raised in dysfunctional families? Well, they soon too become parents. Yeah. And that's the cycle of poverty.
That's the cycle.
You can't always reach the parents when you have this cycle of poverty. Let's talk about the media for a second and how it shapes attitudes. When you have so many media outlets replacing the few we had before, what do you get? You get media outlets that replace fact-based journalism. So when you have this distrust of fact-based journalism, and if you look at the polls, I mean, a vast majority of people in America have distrust of liberals, conservatives, what have you, distrust media. But that minimizes fact-based journalism like the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR. And so that shapes our attitudes as well when we don't have this as a rock, a basis for our thinking. Let's talk about money in politics.
Ed, let me just give you my examples of what you
please.
have said.
Yeah.
In the utility business, we run subsidy programs for low-income people, right? We have for electricity and natural gas, we have subsidies for low-income people. In Washington, D.C., we have never been able to sign more than 30% of the eligible people. There's a distrust. No matter what you do, we have tried hundreds of different ways, reaching through the political system, social system, ads on buses, and so on. But of the eligible people, more than 30% just won't sign up. They don't trust the government. They don't trust the utility. And they just don't want to say anything, because we do have to ask them, what's your income, right? So that they are certified as low income. They just have to self-certify. They don't want to deal with us. So there's a mistrust.
There's a secret agenda they feel going on here. And this may particularly affect Hispanic people who have their own thing going in terms of how their paths to citizenship.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that it's not just the attitude of people who have money. There's such a gap between the feelings of those who don't have the money and those who have the money. And I gave up in frustration. I couldn't find any way to reach more than, normally 20%, even 30%, we just couldn't do it. You just throwing money just didn't work.
Mm-hmm. Regarding money in politics, that too shapes attitudes of people. And the Supreme Court has lifted to the sky income limits, campaign finance limits, I should say, meaning that wealthy voices can outshout those voices concerned about poverty. So ad campaigns of the wealthy inevitably produce misinformation and disinformation. And this seeps into our daily thinking as a society too. I'm going to talk about white guilt for a minute here. People caution against having white guilt over what's called the sins of the past. People say, I was not around then, so why should I feel guilty? Why should I want to do something? And that's a prevalent attitude. And it's designed to absolve, I would say, whites mostly, of responsibility to do something about poverty. The reason I pick on whites a little bit here is that looking at poll after poll, minority people, Blacks, Asian, Hispanics, care more deeply about poverty and the troubles of our society than do whites. So I'm going to have to focus on whites in this regard. But this attitude of white guilt is designed to absolve whites of responsibility to do something about poverty. When I hear the word guilt in a sentence, I replace it with the word responsibility. All of us doing our part, regardless of race, can help us with our attitudes about poverty and defeating poverty. Looking at attitudes on reproductive rights of women, when government forces every woman who is pregnant to give birth, we create lots of new vulnerable children in low-income areas. This will impede progress further, inevitably. Now, to improve attitudes about poverty, we need education about the causes and effects of poverty. Most people don't know about government-backed redlining, for example. The trend, however, is in the opposite direction. We have some states forbidding schools to teach topics that might hurt the feelings of kids. So they teach a whitewash history. And so I don't really understand why kids should feel bad. I don't know why kids of all races can't just identify with our great civil rights leaders who have produced such good results so far. Why do they have to identify with, other people? Regardless, we need to learn our full history before we can begin to focus on reform.
Okay.
Character. Did you have a comment there?
No, I said good. Okay, let's go.
Yeah. We hear so much about the character of low-income people. They're lazy. We've heard it all. They neglect their kids. They're criminals, use drugs, alcohol, and just want to collect welfare. Now, sure, we have all the social ills of dysfunction that we've talked about and its causes, but all these assaults on character tell me that they don't know people in poverty. You see so many good people raising families in near impossible conditions, and it's our responsibility to improve these conditions. And you hear these assaults on characters, not just directly, as I've said, but these assaults on characters in this urban setting can take many forms. For example, like in the stolen election, so-called, of 2020, the blame is often centered on election officials in Atlanta, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Milwaukee. Why is that? Not too subtle, but maybe a little subtle. I don't know. Another real interesting one.
Let me say it, Ed.
Yeah.
Let me say it. They're basically saying that it's those black guys in these big cities that fix the election, right?
Thanks for spelling it out for me.
Yeah,
I'll try to be more direct.
Right.
Good. And please keep doing that. Affirmative action is an interesting topic to talk about. Now, we have people in mostly affluent areas who say affirmative action, they believe this deeply, is a thumb on the scale of justice in favor of those less deserving. Keeps people out who shouldn't be in the first place. But another side of that you hear in low-income communities and minority communities in general is that defeating affirmative action just continues to restrict opportunities. We've had restricted opportunities for many decades, hundreds of years, you want to get down to it, in our country. taking universities, if you look at affirmative action in universities, SAT scores, tutoring, prep school backgrounds are all highly correlated to family income. So, we need to break through all that. There are many talented people who are stifled, and we've had millions of people stifled who don't get to achieve their full potential. Affirmative action probably does need to be rebranded. I'll admit that. Now, in poverty areas, and I'm concluding here, we often hear, what about the children? You hear this deep concern all the time when you go to poverty areas. In affluent communities, what you hear instead is not that so much or hardly at all, but crime in the low income areas. That's because crime affects them in affluent areas, but they don't have any poor kids, so that's not going to be the focus. A dean of Howard University Law School, Herb Reed, once told me that we have a one-word urban policy in America: prison.
Yeah.
That's a pretty profound thought, I think, because there's a pipeline to prison among families in dysfunctional families that we have to break through and get around that for sure, or we're not going to have much of a future in our cities. And by the way, I just want to mention that people living in poverty concentrations do not want to coddle criminals. I've been to dozens of police community meetings where the parents in middle income neighborhoods, minority parents in low income neighborhoods are fighting mad to get the police to pay more attention to fighting crime. And so they want to fight crime as much as, or more really, than anyone else does. So let's get rid of that one right now if we could. Just in conclusion, can poverty be reduced or even eliminated? We have recent studies that say yes, it can. Now, there's a good one out now by Professor Matthew Desmond of how we can actually eliminate poverty. It can be done. And all the tools are there. We know about them: housing, education reform, child tax credits, affordable childcare, and all the rest. And this belief that we can indeed eliminate poverty goes way back, a lot further than 1965, but I'll give you a 1965 analysis by A. Philip Randolph and Dr. King and Baird Russell, who proposed a freedom budget for all Americans. And they took the cost of the Vietnam War and replaced those costs with a budget to reduce or eliminate poverty. And it was pretty powerful to look at that.
Yeah.
Now, on the optimistic versus pessimistic scale, where am I? I'm somewhat optimistic. We are due for a new era of reform. For one thing, society has demographics on its side. And you know that as a college professor, that all the polls show that attitudes among the young are so vastly different than among old timers like ourselves, if I may say. And scholars have demonstrated that going back in history, we have had 50 and 60 years cycles of reform. Periods of great cynicism, like we are now, are followed by reform, and we are due for one of those. There's a scholar named Samuel Huntington.
Yes.
Wrote American Politics: The Promise of Disharmony. It's just a fantastic book. And he goes back to the civil rights era, he goes back to the progressive era, just going by memory. He'll go back to, post-Civil War. He'll go back to the Jacksonian era and talk about how there's an upheaval among the people for social reform. And we are due for one of those. And the cycle of doing something about, let's say, poverty is that part of the cycle follows great cynicism. we're in a period of not just apathy, but great cynicism right now. That collapses and is overtaken by better attitudes of reform. So, I think a lot of solving of these problems is going to take a little bit of empathy. And as the old song goes.
Hang on, Ed. Before you end it, let me say two things. One, okay. I told you this guy has a PhD and practical experience, and we are getting both sides. He's got a lot of articles and other things and scholars he's quoting. At the same time, he's telling us about what he has seen on the ground working with low-income people. And I think that's a great combination of the two aspects that Ed has talked about. And one more thing I would like to add is that it's now something that I learned just a few years ago, that is really between the ages of 0 and 3, that's critical. So one of the tools has to be what is done for kids before they are 3 years old. Then for many people have now shifted to it. Washington, D.C. actually has a policy 0 to 3. Many people have policies 0 to 3, but it's not something that's well known. So I just want to make that point here that if you want to give equality of opportunity, and this is what Ed is talking about, equality of opportunity begins actually when the pregnancy begins and is staying there till 3 years, because if the mother is on drugs or whatever, it's not going to work for the kid. And the first 3 years are really crucial to give the kid a solid foundation on which to build upon. So it's really, I think, one of the tools I would like to emphasize is a bigger focus from pregnancy to age 3. And of course, as Ed said, if they don't want to really give birth, well, they shouldn't be forced to. But that's a separate point. I'm saying in case there is a birth, 0 to 3 is very important.
Indeed it is. And instead of all these silos of this program, that program, and the other program, we need to do comprehensive reform that wraps it all together. Let's wrap in daycare approaches with pre-kindergarten approaches with school reform. Public school needs massive reform. After school tutoring, I just want to quickly say that.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
I've gone into these low income areas and tutoring after in retirement. And people think that low income kids are bored and that's why they go off and commit crime and so forth. That's not quite it. A lot of it is that they fall behind in school. People who have got a head start, as you point out, are not just at 0 to 3, but all the way, that carries, as you point out, all the way through. And so that advantage is going to be a turnoff to kids. They're not bored. They're lost in many ways.
Right.
They may appear to be bored. They may put on that front. But after school tutoring and homework help makes a big difference. I've seen kids squeal with delight. These so-called bored kids squeal with delight when they solve a math program or some other homework issue, and they're able to keep up, and then they go to school all charged up the next day, keeping up with the class. It makes a huge difference.
Okay, it's time for your song, Ed.
We had too much of a buildup of this, but solving this problem will take some empathy. And as the old song goes, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse, walk a mile in my shoes. Now, we can't do that. I can't do that. But we have to use our imagination and try the best we can.
Okay, Ed, thank you for such a wonderful talk. We really understood and heard a lot from you. I think it'll help us understand better what we can do to solve this problem. Okay, that's it for me for today. Next time we'll have somebody else. I want to say bye to the viewers. Bye-bye. See you next time. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, bye-bye.